Do not be fooled by the tyranny of your senses. The world you see, the facts you face, the logic that insists cannot be. All of this is but the echo of yesterday's imagination. You are not bound by reason. You are bound only by the state of consciousness you dare to occupy. To believe when reason denies is the secret of creation. If you only believe what your eyes confirm, then you are imprisoned in the past, for the outer world is nothing more than crystallized imagination. The facts that seem so solid are but shadows of old assumptions. Imagination is the only reality. When reason says no, you must whisper yes within. When the world points to lack, you must feel abundance. When the evidence cries out against you, you must silently walk in the state of fulfillment. It is your inner acceptance that gives birth to outer transformation. Practical wisdom is this: close your eyes, withdraw from appearances, and live in the end. Feel what it would be like if it were already true. Touch it with the senses of your imagination. Let the inner scene become more real to you than the outer facts. Persist. Do not waver, for persistence in assumption hardens into fact, and what reason denied yesterday will kneel before you tomorrow. So tonight, dare to believe beyond reason. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and let the unseen power within you reorder the world. Believe it, when every voice says no, and you will watch the impossible bow before your faith. The senses are deceivers, for they report only what has already been made visible, the aftereffect of imagination clothed in form. What you see, hear, touch, and call reality is not a living truth, but a shadow of what you once assumed to be so. To rely on the senses is to remain chained to history, to walk in circles of repetition, never rising beyond what has already been expressed. The true present power lies not in appearances, but in consciousness. For imagination alone creates. When you shift inwardly, the senses will eventually echo your new assumption. Reason is a loyal servant to the evidence of the senses, and while it has its place in the world of facts, it becomes a prison when allowed to dictate the limits of possibility. Reason says you cannot go beyond what is visible, measurable, and logical. And so it binds you to old facts, to yesterday's conclusions, to the record of what has already been manifested. It insists on repeating the same story, because it can only draw upon what is already known. But imagination is not bound by such restrictions. Imagination is the power that dares to see beyond facts, to conceive of realities unseen, to embrace possibilities that reason calls impossible. It is imagination that sets you free, for it allows you to step out of the circle of repetition and enter the creative act of assuming a new state. When you dare to imagine yourself beyond the confines of reason, you are no longer subject to the chains of appearances. You enter a dimension where faith becomes sight, where assumption becomes substance, and where your inner vision, not reason's calculation, determines the course of your world. The outer world is nothing more than imagination made visible. Imagination solidified, imagination given the weight and texture of reality. Every object, every condition, every circumstance that you call real began first as a thought, an assumption, an inner acceptance that quietly unfolded until it stood before you. The world around you is a mirror, faithfully reflecting the contents of consciousness, and though it may seem independent, it is but crystallized imagination projected outward. To look only at appearances is to mistake the shadow for the source, for the true source lies within the unseen realm of thought and feeling. If you wish to change the outer, you must first transform the inner. No amount of struggling with effects will alter the cause, for the cause is always your state of consciousness. Your world is the hardened shell of past assumptions, the solidified residue of beliefs once entertained. Every limitation you see is a monument to a thought once believed. Every success is the evidence of an inner conviction once held. The moment you realize this, you hold the key to freedom, for you need not fight circumstances, but only shift imagination. By assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, by dwelling persistently in the state of your desire, you are shaping the unseen substance from which the outer world forms. What reason calls real is but a delayed echo of imagination, and what you dare to assume today will inevitably harden into fact tomorrow. To understand this is to stand as master of your world, For you no longer bow to appearances, but command them by mastering the inner realm of imagination. To believe within even when appearances deny it is the secret of all transformation. For the outer world is slow to catch up with the inner vision, and the senses will always try to persuade you that nothing has changed. When you dare to hold faith in the unseen, when you persist in the assumption of the wish fulfilled despite every appearance to the contrary, you are exercising the creative power that shapes destiny. Appearances are nothing more than the residue of old states, the fading echoes of assumptions long past. And if you allow them to dictate your faith, you remain a prisoner of what was instead of the creator of what shall be. Faith is not the agreement with facts, but the insistence upon truth unseen, the conviction that what you have accepted inwardly must manifest outwardly, for consciousness alone is causation. To believe within means to cultivate the inner feeling of already being, already having, already living in the end you desire, while the world outside still reflects the old story. This inner acceptance, held firmly and without compromise, compels the outer world to rearrange itself in harmony with your new state of consciousness. It is easy to believe when everything supports your vision, but true mastery is to believe when every fact shouts no, when logic insists it cannot be, when reason calls it impossible. In those moments, your steadfastness becomes the bridge from the invisible to the visible, from imagination to manifestation. By refusing to yield to appearances, you remain faithful to the reality you have assumed, and your persistence will eventually dissolve the old facts and replace them with new ones born from your inner vision. To believe within, even when appearances deny it, is to honor the truth that imagination creates reality, and that the unseen is the womb of the seen. It is to walk by faith and not by sight, to stand firm in the conviction that your assumption, if persisted in, will harden into fact. It is to know that the world has no choice but to mirror the state you occupy, and that appearances, however loud, are powerless against the quiet certainty of inner belief. Imagination is the only true reality, for everything that appears in the outer world first existed within the unseen realm of thought and feeling. The chair you sit on, the building you live in, the clothes you wear, the inventions you use daily were once nothing but ideas, visions held in the imagination of someone who dared to give form to the unseen. The world of facts, so solid and undeniable to the senses, is but imagination made visible, crystallized into matter and circumstance. To deny imagination is to deny the root of creation, for it is the seedbed of all that becomes tangible. The senses report only what has already been imagined and accepted as true, so to live by them is to remain chained to the past, repeating old conditions under new disguises. Imagination, however, is not confined by what was. It sees beyond appearances and reveals what could be. When you turn within and deliberately assume the state of your desire, you are planting the seeds of tomorrow's reality. The unseen scenes you entertain, the feelings you allow yourself to embody, and the assumptions you persist in. All of these shape the conditions that eventually unfold in the outer world. To say imagination is the only reality is to understand that consciousness is causation. What you accept within yourself as real must externalize, for the outer world is a mirror faithfully reflecting the inner state. If you dwell on lack, you harden lack into fact. If you dwell on abundance, abundance takes form. If you persist in sickness, sickness finds a way to manifest. If you assume health, vitality emerges. Life bends itself to your inner pictures, and circumstances reorganize to align with the vision you entertain. The great error is to think imagination is fantasy, something unreal or detached from practical life. In truth, it is the most practical tool you possess, for it is the very mechanism through which your world is created. What you call reality is nothing but the slow unfolding of imagination. What you call impossible is nothing but an unaccepted idea waiting for belief. Imagination is not a daydream, but the workshop of eternity, the unseen factory where every condition is born before it takes its place in space and time. To live wisely is to give more attention to imagination than to appearances, to treat your inner world as primary and your outer world as secondary. By assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled and making it more real to you than the evidence of the senses, You align yourself with the creative law that governs all manifestation. When you understand that imagination is the only true reality, you free yourself from the tyranny of appearances and take your rightful place as the creator of your experience. To assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled is to step into the creative center of your being. For creation is finished, and every possibility already exists within the invisible field of imagination. What you call desire is simply the awareness of a reality already prepared for you, waiting for your acceptance. The bridge to it is not effort, not struggle, not the reasoning of the mind, but the inner act of assuming its fulfillment, as though it were already accomplished. When you take on the feeling of being or having what you desire, you impress the subconscious mind, and the subconscious faithfully brings to pass what it has been impressed with, regardless of appearances or logic. This act requires you to shift from asking and waiting into knowing and receiving. Instead of looking outward and saying, "One day it will happen," you inwardly say, "It is done." You let yourself feel the reality of your wish in the present moment, as if the scene were unfolding now. If you desire wealth, you dwell in the inner satisfaction and freedom of already being prosperous. If you desire love, you feel the warmth, companionship, and joy of already being cherished. If you desire health, you move as though vitality and wholeness are natural to you. The feeling is the secret, for it bypasses the doubts of reason and plants the conviction of fulfillment deep within the subconscious, which cannot distinguish between what is vividly imagined and what is experienced outwardly. The senses will tempt you to deny this truth. They will point to the absence of your desire, to the lack of evidence, to the persistence of the old story. Yet if you remain faithful to the inner assumption, the outer world will inevitably rearrange itself to mirror it. Every change begins within, and by assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you activate the law of consciousness, which draws circumstances, people, and events into alignment with your inner state. This is not fantasy, nor is it wishful thinking. It is the fundamental principle of manifestation, for the outer world is nothing more than imagination solidified. To practice this, you may close your eyes and withdraw attention from what is. Construct in imagination a simple scene that would imply your desire is already realized. Enter that scene fully, not as a spectator, but as a participant. Touch the objects, hear the sounds, feel the emotions as though it were happening now. Do not strain, but gently relax into the state, allowing the feeling to take hold. The more natural it becomes, the more deeply it sinks into your consciousness, until it begins to dominate your inner conversations and emotional responses. In time, the assumption hardens into fact, and what was once only felt within is confirmed without. Persistence is the key. A single moment of assumption is powerful, but repeated dwelling in the state ensures its manifestation. Do not concern yourself with the how or the when, for those are the domain of the subconscious, which orchestrates the unseen pathways through which your wish becomes fact. Your task is only to remain loyal to the end, to walk inwardly as though it were already so, and to let the conviction of fulfillment color your daily life. By doing so, you shift your dwelling place in consciousness, and where you dwell inwardly, you must also dwell outwardly. To assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled is to acknowledge your creative power, to declare that imagination creates reality, and to live now in the joy of the accomplished desire. It is to move beyond appearances and into the truth that all things are possible to the one who believes. For belief is nothing more than sustained assumption felt as reality. To withdraw from appearances and live in the end is to practice the greatest secret of creation. For the world that surrounds you is only a shadow, a reflection of states once entertained within consciousness. Appearances are persuasive, they clamor for your attention. They insist that what you see is all that is, but to accept appearances as final is to surrender your creative power to yesterday's assumptions. What you behold with the senses is never the truth of your being, it is only the residue of imagination already expressed. To remain loyal to appearances is to remain bound to repetition, to live in a cycle where nothing truly changes. But to withdraw from appearances is to step into the eternal present, to turn away from shadows and into the source, to look not at what is but at what could be, and to dare to occupy it as though it were already true. Living in the end means imagining and assuming the state of the wish fulfilled with such conviction that it becomes your inner dwelling place. It is not something you touch briefly and then abandon when the outer world contradicts it, but a state you inhabit, nurture, and return to until it feels more real to you than the facts that deny it. You do not wait for evidence before you believe, for evidence lags behind imagination. And to wait for proof is to live by sight rather than by faith. To live in the end is to claim now what reason says will happen someday, to feel it, think it, and act as if it were already established. This act is not pretense or fantasy, it is creation itself. For the subconscious accepts the feeling of fulfillment as reality and faithfully reproduces it in the outer world. The art of withdrawing from appearances requires inner discipline. It means refusing to let the senses dictate your faith, refusing to bow to lack, sickness, failure, or rejection, and instead remaining faithful to the unseen vision you have chosen. When appearances shout no, you whisper yes within. When conditions seem unchanged, you persist in the inner knowing that they must conform to the state you occupy. You close your eyes, detach from the visible, and step into the invisible world of imagination where all possibilities already exist. This is where you mold and shape your destiny, for what you accept inwardly will one day stand before you outwardly. To live in the end is to understand that the journey is already complete, that you need not strive to make something happen, but only align yourself with the feeling of it already accomplished. If you desire love, you do not wait for love to appear. You assume the joy and security of being loved now. If you desire wealth, you do not anxiously look at your current bank balance. You inhabit the inner ease of abundance as though it were already yours. If you desire health, you do not obsess over symptoms. You feel the wholeness and vitality of perfect well-being within. In each case, you disregard the appearance of absence and live in the presence of fulfillment. This way of living transforms not only circumstances but also your inner being. You move from doubt to confidence, from fear to assurance, from longing to possession. Your state of consciousness shifts, and because the outer world is nothing more than consciousness objectified, the world must echo your new dwelling place. What once seemed impossible becomes natural. What once appeared distant arrives swiftly. For the end you assumed inwardly becomes the fact you encounter outwardly. Persistence is essential, for appearances will tempt you to return to the old story, to accept what is visible as final. But if you remain steadfast in the end, refusing to be swayed, the invisible will triumph over the visible, and the outer world will conform. Every great achievement, every miracle, every transformation has come from someone who dared to live in the end before it was seen, who held faith in imagination over the testimony of the senses. To withdraw from appearances and live in the end is to live as the master of creation rather than the victim of circumstance. It is to know that reality is not determined by facts, but by faith, not by what is seen, but by what is assumed within. It is to stand firm in the awareness that the end is already yours, and by dwelling in it faithfully, you compel the world to bear witness to the truth of your imagination. Persistence in assumption produces fact, because assumption is the seed of reality, and persistence is the nourishment that allows it to grow into visible form. Every thought, every belief, every inner acceptance you hold is a cause, and the outer world is nothing but the effect. A single moment of assumption plants the seed, but it is the repeated dwelling in that state, the refusal to abandon it when appearances contradict, that ensures its manifestation. What you persist in inwardly must eventually harden into fact outwardly, for consciousness creates reality, and persistence stabilizes the creative act. Most people assume a desire once, feel it briefly, then look to the outer world for confirmation. When none appears, they abandon the assumption and return to the old state. This is like planting a seed today and digging it up tomorrow to check if it has grown. Nothing can grow under such conditions. The law of consciousness requires faithfulness, and persistence is that faithfulness in action. By remaining loyal to the end, no matter what the senses report, you are watering the seed of your assumption until it bears fruit. Persistence does not mean strain or desperate effort. It means quiet constancy, the steady return to the inner state of fulfillment until it becomes natural. When you persist in assuming health, you carry yourself inwardly as one who is already whole, regardless of symptoms. When you persist in assuming abundance, you think, feel, and act from the standpoint of wealth, regardless of temporary lack. When you persist in assuming love, you dwell in the warmth and security of already being cherished, even if the outer world seems cold. Over time, the subconscious accepts this inner state as fact, and because the subconscious is the creative power, the outer world is compelled to reflect it. The power of persistence lies in its ability to override the inertia of old states. The outer world at any given moment is the crystallization of past assumptions, and these may linger even after you adopt a new inner state. If you falter, the old state continues its dominance. But if you persist, refusing to be swayed by appearances, the new state takes root and eventually supplants the old. It is persistence that bridges the gap between imagination and manifestation, ensuring that the unseen becomes seen. Think of the great inventors, dreamers, and visionaries. They persisted in their assumptions despite ridicule, despite lack of evidence, despite the testimony of reason that said their vision was impossible. They lived more in the reality of their assumption than in the facts of their senses, and their persistence produced inventions, breakthroughs, and transformations that reshaped the world. The same principle applies in your life. If you persist in assuming your wish is fulfilled, the world has no choice but to conform, for the outer must follow the inner. Persistence also builds conviction. The more you return to the feeling of the wish fulfilled, the more natural it becomes until doubt loses its grip and the assumption feels inevitable. At first, it may seem like imagination, a fleeting daydream. But as you persist, it solidifies within, and once it becomes a settled conviction, manifestation is certain. Conviction is nothing more than assumption repeated until it feels real. This is why Neville Goddard taught that assumption, if persisted in, will harden into fact. The law does not fail, but it requires loyalty to the unseen. You cannot serve both the vision and the appearance. You must choose one, and persistence is the choice to remain faithful to the vision regardless of appearances. The moment you waver, you give power back to the old state. But the moment you persist, you affirm your creative authority and compel reality to obey. Persistence is not measured in time, but in intensity of faith. Some manifestations may come quickly because the assumption is strong and undivided, while others may take longer because doubt and appearances are given too much attention. Yet the principle remains the same: what you persist in assuming will manifest. The delay is only the resistance of the old state being dissolved by the new. Your task is not to worry about how or when, but to persist in the end with unwavering loyalty. To persist in assumption is to live now in the reality you desire, to return again and again to the feeling of the wish fulfilled until it becomes second nature. It is to refuse to bow to appearances, to stand firm in the inner, knowing that the world must reflect your assumption. It is to understand that no outer circumstance has power over you unless you give it power by abandoning your inner conviction. Persistence in assumption produces fact because the law of consciousness is absolute. Consciousness is the only reality, and what you assume within it must take form without. To persist is to claim your power as creator, to walk by faith rather than by sight, to remain unmoved by appearances and loyal to the unseen. And in time, persistence transforms imagination into reality, assumption into fact, and desire into fulfilled experience. Inner acceptance precedes outer transformation, because the world you experience is not an independent force acting upon you, but a mirror reflecting your state of consciousness. Whatever you inwardly accept as true, regardless of appearances, must eventually shape itself into the fabric of your outer reality. Transformation does not begin on the outside. It does not begin with effort, struggle, or rearranging circumstances. It begins within the silent act of acceptance, in the decision to embody a new state of being, in the willingness to feel and live as though the desired condition were already accomplished. The moment you accept something inwardly, even if the senses deny it, you set in motion the unseen forces that bring it to pass. Many fail in their attempts to change life because they seek to alter the shadow instead of the substance. They fight with appearances, resist conditions, and push against the facts of the senses, never realizing that these facts are but the crystallization of yesterday's thoughts and beliefs. To attempt to change them directly is to wrestle with an echo. The true cause of change lies in the inner realm of imagination and belief. When you accept a new state inwardly, the outer must conform, for consciousness is causation and the world is nothing more than consciousness objectified. Inner acceptance is not wishful thinking or idle fantasy. It is a deep shift in awareness, a deliberate assumption of a new identity, a recognition that what you desire is already yours in the unseen. To accept within is to stop longing and start possessing, to cease asking and begin living in the end. When you accept something inwardly, you give it the dignity of reality, and the subconscious, impartial and creative, takes that acceptance as fact, reproducing it faithfully in your experience. Consider how often people declare they desire something, yet never accept it inwardly. They say they want wealth, but continue to feel poor. They say they long for love, but persist in feeling unworthy or alone. They say they seek health, but identify themselves with sickness and limitation. In each case, the outer mirrors the inner refusal to accept. Desire without acceptance is barren. It produces no transformation because the subconscious cannot act upon what you merely wish for. It acts only upon what you assume as true. Inner acceptance demands persistence. The outer world may continue to reflect the old state for a time, but if you remain faithful to your inner acceptance, the outer must eventually yield. This is why Neville Goddard taught that you must live in the end, that you must feel the reality of the wish fulfilled and remain there until it becomes natural. When you inwardly accept that you already are what you desire to be, you change your dwelling place in consciousness. And because the outer world is nothing but consciousness pushed out, it cannot help but shift accordingly. The process is simple but requires discipline. You begin by withdrawing attention from appearances. You no longer feed the senses with belief, no longer give energy to facts that contradict your desired state. Instead, you turn inward and construct a scene in imagination that implies your desire is fulfilled. You step into that scene and feel it real, not as a future possibility, but as a present reality. You let the tones of reality saturate your being until the acceptance sinks deep into the subconscious. From that moment on, your task is only to persist, to return to the inner acceptance whenever doubt arises, to live as though it were already true. In time, this inner acceptance becomes second nature. It no longer feels like an effort. It becomes your natural state of being. When this happens, outer transformation is inevitable. Life begins to rearrange itself. Opportunities arise, circumstances shift, people move into position, all to reflect the inner reality you have accepted. What once seemed impossible becomes natural. What once appeared distant becomes present. For the world cannot resist the creative power of an accepted assumption. The beauty of this principle is that it places the power entirely within you. You are not at the mercy of circumstances, nor are you a victim of fate. You are the cause of your experience, and the key to change lies in the quiet act of acceptance. Outer transformation is not earned by effort, but claimed by faith. Faith itself is nothing more than inner acceptance held persistently until it externalizes. Even the smallest act of inner acceptance has power. When you accept peace in the midst of chaos, chaos must eventually dissolve. When you accept abundance in the midst of lack, lack must eventually vanish. When you accept love in the midst of loneliness, loneliness must give way to companionship. The outer has no choice, for it is not an independent force, but the obedient servant of the inner state. This is why transformation that begins inwardly endures, while changes made by force or willpower alone often crumble. Without inner acceptance, outer change is temporary, fragile, and easily overturned by old beliefs. But when the change is rooted in consciousness, when the inner state has been truly accepted, the outer transformation is inevitable and lasting, for it has the weight of reality behind it. To live by this principle is to walk with quiet confidence, knowing that you need not fight appearances nor struggle with circumstances. Your task is simply to accept within what you choose to experience without. You live now in the end, you dwell in the state of fulfillment, and you persist there until the world catches up. Inner acceptance precedes outer transformation, because the world is only the reflection of your state of being. And when the state is changed within, the reflection must follow. The impossible yields to unwavering belief, because belief is the creative force that shapes all reality, and impossibility exists only in the realm of appearances and reason. What the world calls impossible is nothing more than a condition not yet accepted within, a state not yet claimed in consciousness. The moment you dare to believe beyond appearances, to hold faith in the unseen with unshakable conviction, the impossible begins to dissolve, and the unseen pathways open to make visible that which once seemed unattainable. The secret is not effort, not pleading, not waiting upon chance or circumstance, but the inner certainty that what you desire is already yours, and must be made manifest, because consciousness is causation and belief is the law by which it operates. Belief is not idle hope or fragile wishing. It is a firm assumption, a quiet knowing that refuses to be moved by appearances. It is the inner acceptance of the reality of your desire, even when every sense denies it, even when logic calls it absurd, even when the facts scream otherwise. Unwavering belief means you do not shift with the winds of circumstance. You do not abandon your vision when outer evidence contradicts it. You do not allow doubt to erode the conviction within. You remain loyal to the unseen reality you have assumed, for you know that the outer world is but the delayed reflection of the inner state. The impossible is only the label placed upon conditions that reason cannot explain. But imagination is not confined by reason. Reason draws its conclusions from what is visible, from what has been, from what can be measured and calculated. Imagination transcends those limits, seeing beyond facts into infinite possibility. When belief joins imagination, the so-called impossible is compelled to yield, because belief fixes imagination into an assumption that must externalize. You may imagine briefly, but without belief, the vision fades away. You may believe faintly, but without persistence, it wavers. Unwavering belief is the marriage of imagination and faith, the inner steadfastness that makes your assumption more real to you than the testimony of the senses. Consider the stories of those who defied impossibility throughout history. Every invention, every breakthrough, every transformation began with one who dared to believe when reason denied it. The airplane, the light bulb, the miracle of healing, the triumph over overwhelming odds, all arose from belief held against contradiction. The world at large saw impossibility, the dreamer saw fulfillment. The world declared it could not be done. The believer lived as though it were already accomplished. And in time, the impossible yielded, because unwavering belief compelled the unseen to take form. In your own life, the principle remains the same. Whatever condition you face that seems immovable, whatever desire feels too distant or too difficult, whatever obstacle looms too large, all of it must bow to unwavering belief if you will persist in assuming the end. You are never asked to know how it will unfold or when it will arrive, for those are matters of the subconscious and the infinite intelligence that shapes events. You are asked only to believe, to accept within as true what you desire, and to remain loyal to that inner acceptance no matter how long appearances deny it. Belief operates not in the realm of effort, but in the realm of feeling. To believe unwaveringly is to feel the reality of your wish fulfilled until it saturates your being. It is to walk in the quiet confidence that it is done, to let the conviction permeate your thoughts, words, and reactions, to see yourself only in the light of the fulfilled desire. When you believe this deeply, doubt loses its hold, and appearances lose their power to sway you. You no longer ask when or how, for the inner certainty has already declared it accomplished. The impossible is undone not by force, but by persistence of belief. Appearances may resist at first, clinging to the old state, echoing the old assumptions. But if you remain faithful, if you continue to occupy the end in consciousness, appearances must eventually conform. The law cannot be broken. What you assume and persist in must harden into fact. Unwavering belief is simply the refusal to abandon the new state, the decision to remain in it until the world aligns. Even the smallest seed of belief, if nurtured, will grow into visible fact. You do not need to know how the seed will sprout. You need only to plant it and water it with persistence. The soil of consciousness will do the rest. To waver is to uproot the seed, to abandon the process before it completes. To believe unwaveringly is to rest in the assurance that the unseen is already working, that the path is already being arranged, that the world is already shifting to accommodate your assumption. What the world calls miracles are nothing more than the impossible yielding to unwavering belief. The laws of consciousness are constant, and those who understand them walk with confidence through conditions that crush others. They do not deny appearances exist, but they deny their authority. They acknowledge facts but refuse to give them finality. They live by imagination and faith, knowing that belief is stronger than reason, that consciousness precedes creation, and that the unseen shapes the seen. When you adopt this way of living, you discover a freedom unknown to those bound by appearances. No condition intimidates you, no obstacle overwhelms you, no impossibility deters you, for you know the truth. The outer world has no choice but to yield to unwavering belief. You become the master of circumstance, not its servant, the creator of destiny, not its victim. You recognize that life bends to the conviction you hold within, and nothing can resist the power of belief that does not waver. To believe unwaveringly is to live as though your wish were already fulfilled, to persist in that state until it feels natural, to let the inner acceptance dominate your awareness. It is to return to the vision again and again, no matter how loudly appearances deny it, until the conviction becomes unshakable. And once it does, the impossible must yield, for belief is the law of creation, and what you believe within must manifest without. The impossible yields to unwavering belief, because impossibility itself is an illusion created by doubt and appearances. When you remove doubt, when you persist beyond appearances, when you hold fast to the inner reality of fulfillment, impossibility dissolves and gives way to manifestation. It cannot resist, for consciousness is the only reality, and unwavering belief is the force that compels the unseen to become the seen.